funny cause the rappers are posing as the gangsters while the government taking money as bonuses for bankers. In life you learn to close your eyes and hold your tongue, but together we will overcome. There's never been a chosen one.
Okay, so day 9 just ended of the COPA trial. They started off with some housekeeping where they discussed how there was a letter sent between Craig's lawyers and COPA's lawyers outlining that they didn't need to cross-examine any of COPA's witnesses. And COPA's lawyers responded to that when they addressed it in the opening moments of the court by kind of condescendingly explaining to them what the implications of that would be. And Craig's lawyers responded by replying that they didn't need it explained to them, that they didn't need law taught to them. So I thought that was kind of an interesting way to start the day. Then we saw 3 witnesses take the stand. They were all sort of asked the same questions at the beginning. They were asked if they had, well, they were all sworn in, and then they were asked if they had been watching any coverage of the trial. Dr. Peng was first up. He said that he'd been watching some Gavin Mail videos and that he'd been reading some CoinGeek articles about the trial. But yeah, they kind of asked him about his work experience with Craig. They worked together at BDO Candles. Apparently, Information Defense used one of his papers, but it was a paper written while he was at BDO. There's something interesting I noted when they were discussing that the I guess the crest or the logo for Information Defense had the saying on it, "Eternal vigilance is the cost of liberty." I just thought that was a little interesting. It kind of stood out, at least to me anyway. Let's see. There was a lot of talk in the morning of this Lego set. So apparently, while he was working at BDO with Craig, Dr. Peng showed Craig this Lego set that he'd purchased, stating that he thought it would be a collector's item someday, that it might have some value in the future. So he kind of purchased it as an investment of sorts. But when he showed it to Craig, Craig challenged him to build a Lego blockchain. And the term was unfamiliar to him. This was before the issuance of Bitcoin. And Craig sort of described it as like a Chinese chain puzzle to him, and explained sort of the concept to him, but asked him to build a blockchain out of Lego blocks. And Dr. Peng described it as sort of Craig flexing on him and like showing how much more he knew about these sort of things, I guess. But it also led into some discussion of him saying that he heard the name Satoshi Nakamoto from Craig, but that initially he didn't commit the name to memory. It was only in hindsight later on, like he heard Craig talking about some Japanese name, and it wasn't later on until he heard the term or heard the word Satoshi Nakamoto talked about in the media that he linked the two together, that he recalled that name was the Japanese sounding name that he'd heard Craig mention. So, I mean, the main point of his testimony here was that he thought he'd heard Craig say the name Satoshi Nakamoto before the issuance of the Bitcoin white paper, and that he discussed blockchain with Craig prior to the issuance of the Bitcoin white paper. Granted, it's not mentioned at all in the Bitcoin white paper. The term blockchain isn't mentioned at all. Just pointing that out there, but it's still relevant. Okay, next up was Mr. Jenkins. Mr. Jenkins said he hadn't been watching any coverage of the trial when they asked him about that. He did work with Craig at Vodafone and the Bank of Australia. So he was talking about how they had discussed alternative banking options. So they were discussing PayPal and eBay and eGold. He mentioned that he made a purchase on the internet with eGold. He said that he discussed concepts related to blockchain with Craig in 2008, 2009, probably prior to the issuance of the Bitcoin white paper. They asked him what Craig's role was at Vodafone and tried to make it seem like Craig was just an ordinary employee, but like Dr. Peng, he emphasized that Craig was an expert who wasn't easy to replace, that he was someone who only a certain number of people could do what he did. Kind of make it seem as though Craig was indispensable to them. So I mean that boded well. It adds credibility to Craig's story that these people are coming out and saying that they heard about these things through Craig before the issuance of the Bitcoin white paper, but it was all hearsay. So COPA's lawyer emphasized that fact, like this is all just you saying these things and you're Craig's friends. Like there's no physical evidence here of any of this. But the big thing that came out from his cross-examination was him discussing that he wasn't, or him specifying rather, that he, although he wasn't sent anything by Craig, that he was shown the Timecoin white paper by Craig. So this really threw off COPA's lawyers. It was actually, I think it came out when Craig's lawyer was discussing it with him. Yeah, it was. And obviously because this was new information that hadn't come out in his prior witness statements, the judge allowed COPA's lawyers to re-examine him, and they just immediately accused him of lying. They insisted on knowing whether or not he had the name Timecoin written on the paper he had before him, and then when he said it was written down in front of him, they asked him who told him to write it down, they accused him of pretty much being coached in writing it down or being coached in mentioning it before the court. He denied that. But yeah, they called him a liar. They insisted that he must have had it written down before he went in and spoke with him that day, but he kind of explained with his notes how he'd written them out that day and showed them to the judge. So I'm sure someone will probably observe the footage of him, see if he was writing stuff, see if they could tell if he was writing. But that was the really interesting thing that came out from his cross-examination. Next, they moved on to Mr. Yusef. So he was sworn in. He said that he hadn't really watched anything from the trial, or about the trial. He said that he had enjoyed certain religious discussions with Craig, that he, as a Muslim, thought it was interesting that Craig had read the Quran and that he could discuss it with him. But a lot of the work was about him being a director, but he had some background in distributed networks and cybersecurity. But a lot of the questioning seemed irrelevant towards Mr. Yusef, and I think fairly early on it seemed like, just from his body language, that he wasn't expecting this line of questioning, that he thought he was going to be asked about things that were more relevant. There's a comment from Craig's lawyer at the end that it didn't seem relevant, most of the line of questioning, and for the most part it didn't seem relevant. A lot of the questions pertained to the intent behind Craig's actions and things that Craig had said, and it wasn't something that he was able to answer to. You can't answer to what someone else's intentions are. And there was a particular question where he was asked what Craig's motivation would be for sending an invoice, or for saying that there was an invoice that had to be sent to him when there wasn't. But he can't speak to why Craig would have done anything, so it was silly for him to try to repeat the same question essentially 3 or 4 times by just rephrasing it. I think the judge even got a little irritated with that and made a comment about how, like, let's move on, like, we asked the same question, like, the same way 5 times, like, you can't answer that question. And yeah, there was nothing particularly interesting that came out from his testimony, really. I think, yeah, it was largely just an attempt to try to discredit Craig through him. That's what it seemed like. That's what I believe Craig's lawyers accused them of. So yeah, it was an interesting change of pace today, but it wasn't super exciting. The last few days, I mean, well, certain things about this trial so far have been like a Hollywood movie. I mean, the discussion of just the Lego thing is hilarious to me. Those sets are pretty expensive now if you go to buy them online, I'm sure. I saw there's some up online already that are marked up quite a bit just because they've been mentioned in the trial now, so I mean, there's certain details that I can't convey just because I'm summarizing the trial, but it's actually been a really, really interesting trial, and I'm sure one day, win or lose, regardless of what the outcome is for Craig, they're going to make a movie about this trial one day, because there's so many different things that have been discussed, and there's so much detail, and there's so much history to go through, that just, it's making it fairly interesting, even though it's court and it can be dull at times. The content matter itself is quite interesting, so I'm excited to see what happens tomorrow. 3 new witnesses. Yeah, we'll see what tomorrow holds. Like, share, and subscribe.